Thank you for joining us at this lunchtime webinar. I'm Christina Chotter. I'm the Deputy Editor of International Affairs. We are really lucky this afternoon to be joined by Maria Louise Clausen and Peter Albrecht, who are both senior researchers at the Danish Institute for International Studies. And they will be speaking about the past and future of Western interventions, based on their recent article in the journal called Interventions Since the Cold War, From State Building to Stabilization. And my colleague will be posting a link to the article, which you should definitely check out after the webinar if you haven't read it already. Our speakers will be starting with opening remarks for about 14-15 minutes. And then I'm going to open the floor to your questions, and the event will finish at 1:45. Peter, can I hand over to you?
Yes, you can. Thank you very much, Christina. Pleasure to be here today. So I'll start out just in terms talking here today and give some of the background and the ideas for the article that Maria and I have written. It actually started a couple of years ago. Obviously, it takes time to write these articles. So a couple of years ago, Maria and I started discussing these issues, but actually from the other way around, so to speak, because we were sort of wondering why have interventions moved the way they have over the last 30 years, and where have they come to? So because the end of the Cold War was, of course, not the beginning of history, and certainly not the end of it, but it constituted a fundamental break in how global security and politics were and are conceived. And I think the reason why I'm saying that is, of course, because there's a tendency to start at the Cold War as sort of a starting point, and clearly it's not the starting point, but certainly a sort of a fundamental break, if you could say. So we have split this presentation and also following the article that we did into a 30-year period, this 30-year period since the Cold War, into three phases of interventions, with the 1990s after the Cold War characterized by integration, the 2000s after 9/11 characterized the terrorist attacks on 11 September 2001 characterized by replacement, and the 2010s characterized by delegation. And Maria and I will go through these phases and explain to you what we mean by integration, replacement, and delegation. And we'll do it quickly because we only have 14 minutes. So very quickly, I'm going to go through the two first phases, and then Maria is going to conclude with the third phase, and then also with some concluding sort of remarks showing the way forward. So, of course, after the Cold War ended in the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama, a prominent public intellectual that everybody probably know, proclaimed that an unusual consensus had emerged regarding the liberal democracy as a legitimate system of governance. And this was, of course, just after the Cold War, as I've said several times now, and the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a period characterized by unprecedented optimism and a strong belief in the liberal democratic project as an ideological, but also a military project. So basically, because of course the Soviet Union had fallen apart, there was this idea that the liberal democratic form of governance was the only way forward. This was also why, as Fukuyama, that I just mentioned before, was able or could conclude in a way that sort of convinced a lot of policymakers, at least, and certainly also a few academics, that history was over, that the big battle of ideologies had finished. So this gaze on the world, the liberal peace thesis, gave impetus to international intervention and an understanding of liberal democratic states as superior, less likely to go to war with one another, and universally attractive. And it's this universal attractiveness of the liberal democracy that wasn't really questioned, and therefore had this strong impetus behind it. There was an almost sort of uninhibited belief in liberal internationalism with a mix of democratic ideals and capitalism. And there was also the assumption that this form of governance would be for the greater good globally, and this generated a focus on integration between the West and states that were the aim of intervention outside North America, Europe, and a few other places like Japan and Australia. So basically, there was an idea in the 1990s, an idea that many believed in, that the liberal democracies could be exported and the world could be changed into the image of the West, following this ideal governance system. Within this debate, so the more sinister side of this, of course, because there's always one of those, within this debate was, of course, also a discussion about how to avoid a repetition of the genocides that took place in Rwanda in 1994 and in Bosnia in 1995. And of course, these were horrible events that the world wanted to prevent happening again, but they also led to what has been dubbed the humanitarian decade, where states, but the big change, the sinister change that also happened was that sovereignty was increasingly questioned. So the right of citizens were increasingly taking center stage rather than states' absolute power over them. And this meant that in the case of Rwanda, in the case of course, also Bosnia and Serbia in the 1990s, if these states could not protect their citizens' rights, they opened themselves up to intervention from the outside. So this was done in the name of liberal democracy, but there was also seen as a legitimate reason to intervene because there was not in the 1990s a fundamental questioning of this type of intervention. So the first fundamental break that we're going to talk about here is, of course, 9/11. I mean, I think the 1990s and this idea in liberal internationalism did not really get a chance to play itself out, sort of in terms of actually testing all these ideas of transforming the world into liberal democracies, because 9/11 happened, which of course also was related to the types of interventions, but also the gaze of the West on the rest of the world that was occurring in the 1990s, it took place in the 1990s. But certainly 9/11 was quite an abrupt, rude awakening from this dream of the liberal democracy. And it's the second phase that we talk about as replacement. And I'll get back to what replacement is, just say a little bit about what characterized this phase. So now security was to a much larger extent becoming a question of controlling and undermining transnational jihadism. This was, of course, sort of catapulted onto the international agenda by 9/11. And the greatest threat no longer came from an identifiable sort of enemy in the Soviet Union or big identifiable armies, but from weak and even, as they were called in this particular moment in history in the early 2000s, failed states. It was a chaos that emerges when states fail. So the chaos that emerges when states fail was no longer seen as an internal problem in those states. During the 1990s, the biggest threat, as was sort of discussed internationally, was that these countries were becoming unruly and collapsing onto themselves. But it was really sort of seen as sort of a problem for these states themselves that we in the West could then help them overcome. In what changed quite dramatically after 9/11 was that these failed states were no longer seen as sort of necessarily or primarily even an internal problem to their citizenry. They threatened international security and stability. So the decade after 9/11 was characterized by continued emphasis on expanding the notion of human security that actually evolved in the 1990s. That security is not just about state relations, but about safeguarding the individual's right to safety. And this focus on human security meant that sort of how we understand security expanded, and sort of the war on terror that really came out of 9/11, led by the Americans, really opened up to the same sort of expansive understanding of what security was, more comprehensive of what constitutes a threat, and more comprehensive in terms of what means can be used to actually deal with these security threats. The US was no longer, So in this phase after 9/11, interventions were less about delivering on this global South potential as in the 1990s, which really was also, of course, there was the geopolitical interest at stake, but it was also a question of actually looking at the global South and thinking we have the tools for other people to live a happier life with the type of governance systems that at our disposal. And now it became just more about simply preventing the chaos and security which spread from these failing states to the West. And this is, of course, also a big change in how governance systems were seen. States were seen as somebody to help or somebody to sort of like prevent and push to the side. And therefore, you could also say, as we do in the article, that international interventions became much more explicitly about serving Western interests. This was clear from investments in the military aspect of state building, as it was now called, meaning support of weak states, military and police, which far exceeded investment in civil institutions. And again, the US is a good example, which in 2008 funded 41.5% of global spending on the military. And the American interventions, of course, American-led, I should say, interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq illustrate how interventions after 9/11 were more about confronting threats against the West than anything else, really. Therefore, it was also a new type of intervention that, instead of focusing on transforming existing security systems, tried to remove what there was and build it really from scratch, these systems. And I just really briefly want to say that Iraq obviously is a prime example of this, and also that I won't go into Iraq because I don't have time for that. And I now want to leave it to Maria to go through the third phase.
Thank you, Peter. Maria?
Yes, so thank you. And as already mentioned, I will take over here from Peter to briefly detail the final and third phase that we outline in the article, and then finish off with a few reflections on the future of Western interventions. So as outlined by Peter and kind of where he left off, the failure to produce liberal democratic polities in Iraq and Afghanistan, despite these enormous investments in long-term state building, contributed to a growing questioning of the liberal democratic state as a universal ideal. This led to downscaled forms of intervention, but not to a stop of interventions. In the article, we argue that the most intense debate now focuses more on not so much whether to intervene, but how to intervene. And the background for this is diminished support in the West for large-scale military interventions. In particular, there is limited political appetite for risking the lives of soldiers in wars fought far from home. But the global North or the West continues to see weak and fragile states as a security threat that they would like to influence. So we argue in the article that this leads to different types of interventions, but types of interventions that seek to limit the troop deployments by the global North. And likewise, within development, there is a continued drive to shape and contain these fragile states through interventions, despite the simultaneous desire to be more cost efficient. And this is, for example, seen in this shift from state building to stabilization. Stabilization has a much more limited transformative ambition compared to state building as it was advocated in the 1990s and 2000s, as outlined by Peter, and instead focuses more on rebuilding existing structures of authority to allow local elites to more quickly regain responsibility for the state and its institutions. So these types of interventions often use the rhetoric of partnerships and local empowerment, but we argue that we now understand these concepts, or they play out in ways that introduce distance between the intervener and the intervened. So in the article, we point to two overall trends that characterize this introduction of distance, or the practice of delegation that Peter mentioned. The first trend is the attempt to not just minimize threat to troops in the global North, but to remove those threats altogether through an increased reliance on technology. Technology is believed to allow security actors in the global North to target terrorists more effectively while avoiding expensive and unpopular troop deployments. As such, these increasingly sophisticated technological tools enables the intervener to observe from a distance, safe from the immediate physical harm of the intervention itself. One example of this outsourcing of warfare to technology is, of course, the increased reliance on drones, which is perceived as a less costly and more precise counterterrorism strategy. But technology has become part of interventions in multiple ways. This also includes the introductions of systems of technical standardization and performance auditing that is constructed to allow the intervener to maintain a sense of overall control of the mission despite of the distance introduced into the relationship. So whereas the introduction of technology introduces distance between the intervener and those targeted for intervention from the perspective of the intervener, this distance is not felt by those being targeted by the intervention. They don't have the luxury of distance. Instead, these technologies such as drones, GPS tracking, biometrics, they allow the intervener access and control over private data and the ability to constantly monitor and track and watch movements and communications on the ground, but from afar. This leads me to the second trend in the introduction of distance into warfare, namely the delegation of interventions to actors in the global south. We argue that there is a growing tendency in the West to limit overseas engagements and instead attempt to shift the burden of intervention to local partners, both bilaterally and multilaterally. This delegation is often framed, as I said, using the language of partnerships, but is characterized by separation and the division of labor. This division of labor allows the global North to distance itself again from the cost of intervening, as the cost is delegated to the Southern partner. This also illustrates that the global North's willingness to prioritize stability over transformation has increased. As such, the global North maintains the ability to intervene via proxies and uses the notion of partnerships to maintain a sense of equal commitment while minimizing the risk to interveners from the global North. But of course, this introduction of distance also comes with a price, because it leaves the global North detached from events on the ground and then increasingly reliance on reports and the actions of its partners. So these developments that I've just briefly outlined, we see continuing to evolve and shape interventions. We see that the appetite for large-scale interventions remain limited, where there is a continued interest in influencing events in the global South, particularly when these directly impact or have the potential to impact the West or the global North. Moreover, we are entering a time, we think, where we see an increased number of actors, including regional great powers or aspiring regional great powers, in addition to known actors such as Russia and China, that are intervening in different ways, but in the same conflicts and countries that the West also has an interest in trying to influence. At the same time, some of the tools, especially in terms of technology, are becoming more sophisticated to the degree where it's increasingly difficult sometimes to see or to decipher who intervenes and where and in what ways. Finally, the ideals of the West no longer have the same universal appeal, as I started by saying. Both internally in the West, but also globally, we see increased critique of the universality of the liberal international world order. These responses point to this world order as being moralistic and Western-centric. So this discussion that reflects an increased questioning of the hierarchy that is implicit or even sometimes explicit in this type of interventions take place globally. We end the article by arguing that pointing to the failure of Western interventions in some ways open up as many questions as the answers. And so I think I will end the same way here. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Louise. So we have a really interesting comment and the question from Rafael Moretto. So in his comment, he sort of questions this division between the global North and the global South. And I think you alluded to that, Maria Louise, as well, but with the rise of sort of non-Western actors who might be intervening in the future. So do you see them sort of going through the same pattern as Western interventions, or do you see these being different, or them trying different methods? Or Peter, or yeah.
Okay. I think it's actually a very interesting question in terms of also what gaze are we having on the world as we write this article, because we're also standing from a certain place looking at interventions in a certain way, and I think this is quite, the article in itself is a very sort of, it's a self-critical in a way article about how we look at our part of the world that we are actually ourselves members of, and how interventions are taking place, which is also why we sort of talk about the West and look North. So actually in the revisions, we were asked not to use with the West, which we originally did, because we thought that was a quite concrete way to say this is the gaze that we're having in this article, this perspective that we're looking at it from. But yeah, so that's one answer to this question about, actually it's a point of view, this article. It's not an objective global truth about how interventions looked at from all over the world. About the question about whether they will go through the same process, undoubtedly that will happen, because there are different countries that intervene in different ways. But what will be certain is that they will meet the same resistance as the West has met, obviously, because I think one of the underlying sort of currents in the article is that people don't want to be forced to change into the image of somebody else. So whether it's the Western, it's a US-led intervention, or whether it's China that intervenes in a more robust way that we have seen until this point, that resistance will be there regardless. And you can see, of course, Afghanistan, even though Maria and I has talked about, we are not Afghanistan experts, any of us, but certainly there have been intervention after intervention by global superpowers in Afghanistan, and there's been resistance every time. So I don't think it's actually new to sort of look at these other actors. But I think that sort of just to respond to the issue of whether we're sort of like generalizing interventions as Western. No, we're talking about Western intervention per se, and it's a deliberate sort of attempt to self-critique our approach to interventions from where we are also.
Yeah, can I just add also, because I agree with everything Peter said there, but I also just want to I also just want to add, and it's something that we also discussed while writing the article, that not intervening is also a decision that has implications. And of course, that's sometimes much more difficult to say, and sometimes you come into the counterfactuals, like what would have happened if we hadn't intervened in this and their place, which of course makes it more difficult. But I think when we discuss the ethics of intervening, we also need to discuss the ethics of not intervening, which can be a very complicated matter, because there's a trend, I think, increasingly to question the ethics and the notions behind interventions. But so that's just an add-on.
Yeah, I think can I add to that, Christina? Okay.
Go ahead.
Because this is actually one of the biggest probably differences between Maria and I in this article, because I think I would be more radical in my conclusion based on our study to say that no, actually interventions have failed. We have failed to do what we set out to do, and we have made, in many ways, the world more insecure. And this is, as Maria says, counterfactual, because we don't know what would have happened if we had not intervened. But I just don't see any of these interventions fundamentally doing what they set out to do, or maybe even, in many cases, making the places they intervened in more stable. So I think there is definitely room for a much more fundamental question about how interventions should take place in the future. That I don't think we happily sort of like skip over that part in our article. Maybe that's the next one we should write, about how then actually or look at interventions. But there's definitely, based on the last 30 years, a need for fundamental questioning of interventions. And I think the way that it's moving now, where we're doing it through other armies, we're paying the Kenyans, Ethiopians to fight wars for us in Somalia, because we're doing the same in Mali with other countries, of course, using robots to fight wars. I mean, there is a moral issue there that definitely that is being discussed, obviously. So it's not something that's not being discussed, but certainly also requires more sort of discussion about what have interventions become.
And I do hope that you write another article, because I did get the feeling that you left the current one on sort of a moral cliffhanger, because you talk about the moral bankruptcy of the current Western approach. But I really did make me wonder what would be a better option morally, from a moral or ethical perspective.
So I think sort of one of the, I have sort of, I've worked in the UN mission in Somalia, for instance. I've worked in the practical side. And I think what you often meet is, it's better to do something than nothing. Well, no. I mean, sometimes it's better to not do anything. If you don't have anything better to do than what's being done in many of these interventions, billions of dollars being spent, maybe you should not do it. And so I don't, it's sort of a, so what else should we do? Well, think about your place in the world, think about realistic outcomes of the practices that you're sort of putting into the world. Sorry, Maria.
Maria, would you like to add anything?
No. I mean, I think, clearly it's something, because I think most of us, when we look out into the world, we can very clearly see that some of the major interventions, and now we have Afghanistan just, front and close up, has clearly not succeeded in the goals that they set out. And you can even question whether those goals were even sustainable or something that we wanted to push onto the world. But I think exactly that we end the article in this way, which I agree is a sort of a cliffhanger, because it is, I think generally there is in the literature a lot of critique of interventions. We're certainly not alone in this by any measure, but I think that there is also this gap, or this need, or these discussions that need to go further in terms of then what, because we look at the world, and now we're talking also about sort of military types of interventions, but in many ways you also have financial, humanitarian. You have many kinds of interventions that can be on the surface less problematic, but in principle, or actually in practical terms, can be even as, or even more so, have circumstances on the ground that are very detrimental to the area. So I think this discussion, and the way that we left the article is just our way of saying that it would be great to see these discussions move further, and of course we would be happy to try and think of ways to do that.
Great, thank you. And so in your article you talk about the move from phase to phase as driven by Western needs. So we had a question about local actors and citizens. How do you see sort of their agency, or sort of in the past, and do you see them having more agency in the future?
I certainly think that there is a lot of agency, and has been, and I think here you also have to distinguish, and of course this is also a matter of where you target the analysis, because there's a huge difference between the ideals and the program documents and the speeches and these things going into a context, guiding an intervention, and what actually takes place on the ground. And certainly on the ground, a lot of things happen that were not the intention of the formal intentions of the. So in that sense, there's you cannot intervene without, and has never been able to intervene without having local actors very much influencing the way that this intervention plays out. I think now what we're seeing, of course, is that there is more of a debate on higher levels as well about this universal ideals of Western, the Western democratic liberal sort of riparian state. I think there are also interesting discussions about alternative ways of organized representative government, so that we understand that this is not only an idea and a concept that exists in the West, but that you have alternative understandings of authority and the way that can play out that might be more relevant in a given context. So I think some of those discussions are perhaps an example of where you see an increased agency playing out now.
I fully agree with Maria said, and adding to that is also, I think the failure is an indication of agency. I mean, the fact that that these projects are failing, we just don't understand then what the implication of that should be for our actions, our practices. And I think that's really sort of, I think it's a case in point that actually who's leading these sort of like changes, transformations? How are people engaged in leading those changes and transformations? I think it's really the issue. And it's also how do we, it goes back to also what's very much part of the underlying sort of discussion of the paper, like when we're talking about failure, fragile states, of course that concept has been debunked dramatically in the last 15 years. It's not used almost academically anymore because it has been, but it's still being used, of course, in policy because it's also a handy sort of like catch-all phrase. But the failure is also a problem to look at the world like that, because it doesn't say then what is there instead. What is it actually? What governance systems do exist? And that's obviously, it's been said a million times before, but it's obviously understanding what's on the ground and what is the acceptance of external involvement in making these transformations. But I think failure is sort of indicated. The failure of the interventions are very much about the agency that we don't recognize.
Great. And I think sort of related to this, we also have a question on feminist foreign policy, and if you see any role for it in the context of Western interventions.
can we get a little bit more sort of in what way do you mean? Is it like post-colonial?
Well, I think so. The question is, how do you see the concept in the light of the changing nature of Western interventions?
Okay, so should I start, Maria? Okay, so this is not my theoretical field, so forgive me. But I think definitely, sort of from a more post-colonial point of view, it's against broadening out the voices that are defining exactly how intervention should be taking place. So that's at least what I would take away from that. And I think that's also it's not really, we don't really sort of say, it's just as we just discussed, there's a cliffhanger in the article about, we don't really say then what should be done instead. But certainly it's sort of based on the work that I've done a lot as an anthropologist, but also it is of course broadening out, multiplying the types of voices that are involved in actually defining what intervention should look like, how they should be involved, and also accepting that we do not have the answers to these questions. We do not have the answers to what a correct right society should look like that is coming out of conflict, even though we have this propulsion in the West to go in and sort of tell other people how to organize themselves. That is probably the biggest fault of interventions. And having worked with a lot of people in the context of these interventions, there is a very rudimentary understanding also sometimes of what needs to be done, because we have an idea about what works in our societies, a very idealistic idea that rarely works actually in practice. And we're trying to not force it, but integrate it into the way that we interact with other people. And there's not a lot of understanding of fundamentally different ways of organizing oneself. And I think you can hear I'm not a feminist, a critical theory scholar, but for me, that would definitely be the importance of taking into account different voices, different approaches, and really taking them into account, not just lip sync.
Can I just briefly add to that? And I will also say I'm also not a feminist foreign policy scholar in any way. So I'll just relate it to a case that I know very well, the Yemeni one, where I think one of the questions or discussions that have taken up a lot of space there is that you have UN-led negotiations, there peace negotiations that completely neglect women. They're simply not present. And then you bring them in as track 2, track 3. I mean, you have a sort of parallel side negotiation that almost can have the, and I of course should be careful, but it can almost seem like it's an afterthought or a realization that you want to include female voices. And then, so there's clearly something problematic in that, because how can you have an inclusive, sustainable peace if you leave out half the population in the discussions? But then on the other hand, we also, as Peter said, we have to make sure that the way that we, because in the West, we have certain understandings of interventions, but also of mediation and how these processes play out. And if we come again to these contexts and tell them how to carry out these types of negotiations or mediations, then again, I think we are pushing our ideas and notions onto contexts that very often have, at least in the Yemeni case, they have very ingrained and skillfully developed notions of how to mediate and talk and do political conversations. So they don't need us to tell us how to do that. Sorry, the other way around. They don't need us to tell them how to do that.
And I think just to add to that, I think sort of one of the main takeaways from the work that I've done as a practitioner is they don't necessarily want what we have. I mean, you can have all your great ideas about how to do things, but if they don't see you as having a solution, which people, the other, if we can use that horrible concept, the other doesn't see the West as having the answers. I think in Somalia, again, I mean, I had a colleague who worked in the Ministry of Defense. He was fired by his counterpart in the Somali Ministry of Defense every day he went into work. And he still continued to go back, because that's also the political economy about on interventions that he's part of as sort of like an actor. So it's also about what is it actually that we are sort of offering? I think maybe that point I've made a few times now.
Okay, so next we have a question on China's concept of developmental peace. So do you see it becoming more influential on attitudes towards intervention within the West or within the global North in the future?
I mean, again, the caveat, the sort of like the, obviously not a China expert myself, but so there are 2 points to that. The one is that, of course, as Maria also has just alluded to, and that one of the discussions we've had, who's going to intervene if we're not intervening? And certainly, of course, China is one of the big actors that we know is already very much present, both formally, officially, and unofficially in across at least the West Africa where I work, and certainly also in East Africa. So of course, China is going to play a much larger role and will continue to do that in both very obstructive and possibly also productive ways. I think if you look at China's role in West Africa, I mean, you know, because often the sort of the accountability mechanisms, also the legislation and the enforcement of that legislation is quite scanty, if you could say that like that, or weak. It is also exploited, and certainly both with fishery, with mining in Ghana, where I work right now, the Chinese are very much present in the illegal sort of like informal sectors. So I think talking about narrowly about sort of like one policy of China in these contexts is really sort of disregarding the considerable major role that China is playing in these places, both formally and informally.
Can I just add again? I'm also not a China expert, so just meeting China from the field, which is my case, is primarily in the Middle East, primarily Yemen and Iraq. And I for example, recently did a survey in Iraq where I also asked about different external actors, and here China was the most well-liked external actor. So that was interesting. Iran was the least well-liked. And what I want to say with that is, I think China, of course, have they have an advantage, if you will, in the Middle East, at least because they don't have this heavy burden of colonialism, and they're seen as an external actor with less of an history, whether true or not, but that is often how they are perceived. And then when they come in with their types of intervention that are often based on financial, economic cooperation and much less on human rights or good governance or rights to women or all these concepts, they seem on the surface very attractive as partners. But I think, as Peter is also alluding to, I think increasingly there is a recognition that working with China and the approach that they take to intervening also comes with consequences, especially when you, for example, have to repay those loans that were given to you previously, or when you start to see the impact of some of their interventions.
Can I just add to Maria? I think also it's sort of like, I saw just one of the comments while Maria was talking as well about sort of, if you don't do it, others will, like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, China. But that's already happening, I think. You know, I mean, if you go to Somalia again as a case, the UAE, Turkey, the US, the UK are all playing a role inside Somalia in parallel to the UN. So the fact, and again, it's also like we need to stop and think about, what are we then starting now? Are we starting new proxy conflicts, indirect conflicts in these countries because we don't want the Chinese to come in and play a role, a dominant role in a place like Somalia? It's not a good example actually, because China is not present as other countries in Somalia. But the point is, it's still the same. Is it now that we're sort of like ramping up sort of like conflict potential with other countries in African countries because we don't want to have a direct confrontation? Well, that's proxy wars that were very much sort of like current during the Cold War. So we are doing a repeat of certain types of conflicts that we would have hoped that the Cold War was the end to, but clearly the way that we're discussing this sort of internationally and also in policy circles is that we need to do something. And it's that need to do something that I think we need to really think about in terms of what we actually will get out of it in the short to medium term.
Can I just add, and I know we're running out of time, but I think that there are two things, and here it's where Peter and I perhaps slightly diverge, because, you know, working in the Middle East, I often hear two things. I mean, I hear people saying, first of all, why, you know, for example, the EU, who's involved in a lot of financial support to Iraq, for example, but they perhaps don't have the political clout to come with that. And, you know, that might be a deliberate decision, because you're choosing to give the aid to support the Iraqi state, so you don't want to take credit for it yourself. But this can leave, sometimes I had Iraqis tell me, you know, why is it that the EU is not more present? Why is it not being more actively? Why is it not, you know, strengthening itself so that it can counteract and act as a positive counterbalance to some of these more, you know, sometimes actors that are seen as more problematic? And I think that's an interesting point, you know, that you know, sometimes you will have actors, I mean, and what do you do with that if you have the West that is so preoccupied with its own sort of moral, ethical considerations that we become sort of, it's become difficult for us to act. And you have other actors which certainly do not have all these ethical, moral deliberations, and they act. And then you have people on the ground standing saying, you know, what are we supposed to do in this game? So whereas I completely recognize what Peter is saying, and I'm certainly not advocating, you know, interventions in any way, and I completely, you know, agree with the failure of what we've been doing, but I also just think that there is this other side to it.
And I think, just to add to that, very shortly, I think that Maria is probably choosing the more difficult road than I do in this debate, where maybe I'm more dismissive completely of interventions than actually what Maria is obviously doing is a much more difficult sort of like road to travel.
So I'm going to take one more question. So on the role of colonial borders. So do you think there has been too much emphasis in the past on maintaining colonial borders and bringing those societies together? And do you think the way forward might be for the international community to be more flexible and to allow the changes to these borders?
Wow.
Maria, I think
that's a horrible last question.
Sorry.
Oh dear.
Yeah, 1 minute each.
How do we disentangle the history of the West and the Berlin Conference in the 1800s that made those borders? I mean, it's such an entangled history that we are then trying to sort of like maybe overturn, but that we're questioning. And of course, could we go back and not divide Africa up, for instance, among a number of colonial powers? Probably that would have been a great idea. Could we change the fundamental way that geography is structured? Yes, that would be great as well. But how do you do that in a way that does not collapse into complete chaos and conflict? So I think there are so many underlying issues with that. I mean, I think you can't, of course, sort of like say, right, Somaliland, you go your way, Puntland, you go your way, and then not have it in hundreds of other. And I know hundreds of other countries. I know that that's a lot often the argument that is made. But I think also, who can judge that? Who can be the judge of whether a country should be split up into different types of sort of geographical spaces? And having to make that decision. So it's again a question of who's making that decision, and I think that's a big question.
Maria?
Yeah, I mean, very, very, very briefly on a very complex question. So forgive me for the lack of nuance. You know, I think, you know, you know, very briefly, I was thinking like there's two levels. There's this aspect of international recognition, and how do we deal with inviting new states into the international systems of states, which sort of brings me into the, you know, working on both Yemen and Iraq. I have two cases where we have very strong independence, or whatever you want to call them, movements that are asking for a redistribution, let's say, of borders. And you know, one aspect is this international recognition, but there is recognition, but there is also this whether some of these entities would be sustainable states. And of course, this is linked to each other because, we are so conservative in the way that we think political authority and legitimacy and sovereignty, that this state has become our go-to place. But it's a historical misnomer in a sense. It's not a universal truth that we need to be divided up to or into states as they are currently. But at the same time, we do have an international system. And as Peter says, like if you start messing with that, how do you make sure you don't end up in anarchy and chaos? So I really don't have the answer. Yeah, sorry.
So I'm afraid we'll have to leave it here.
It's great to end on a notion of not having answers. So.
With more questions than answers, that's the way we like it.
And we did have some really interesting questions. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Maria and Peter. And yes, I would urge everyone to go now and read your article.
Okay, read the article.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, if someone feels like they've been neglected, you can find us and you can write us, and we would be happy to engage in dialogue and conversation.
Always.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.